G'day you mob, Pete here. This is the last installment of my little series with Kyrin down from the Mere Mortals podcast. Go and check out his podcast. Today we talk about Guns, Germs and Steel, a book by Jared Diamond that looks at why certain cultures around the world developed what they did when they did and others didn't. We talk about why different countries and cultures are so different across the globe, despite us all being the same species, Homo sapiens. Why didn't other groups of people invent things like writing or domesticate animals or create economies and innovate like what happened in Europe and Asia over the last few thousand years? Where would we be technologically if it hadn't been for the big wars of the past? You know, if we hadn't got things like the jet engine, atomic bombs, and certain medical procedures, where would we be today? If Einstein and Newton hadn't been born, would someone else have come up with their theories of relativity and gravity? How are we going to look back at COVID? Which countries did well or poorly in their dealing with the pandemic? You know, what's hindsight going to give us? And lastly, crazy inventions of the past made by geniuses way ahead of their time. Things like the Jacques-Droz automata and the anti-Kythera mechanism. So without any further ado, guys, let's get into today's episode.
What's this thing? There's the Guns, Germs and Steel, which is Jared Diamond's book, where he talks about, he argues more historically it was more of the land. So I think he was trying to say it's people everywhere are roughly the same, and it's it was more decided on landscape and on, you know, things like germs. And so, like, you know, the Americans would come and it would just wipe out the native Indians in America, and that's why they never sort of formed, you know, societies and stuff. Like, they just would get wiped out. But then there's other arguments where you could say it's like racial differences, just temperament, you know, and this is where it gets into like dangerous territory, because it's like, you know, what are the IQ differences between different races? What are the you know, like temperament in terms of aggressiveness between different races? That's where it's like you get in trouble for talking about those things.
Well, I think the biggest issue is that a lot of these places didn't have domesticatable animals that say Europe did, right? So, you know, they ended up with the sheep, the cow, with the goat, with the chicken, with all these, you know, things partly through Asia as well. But that Eurasian continent had all these animals that by chance ended up being able to be turned into farmable animals. And then these crops like grass and, you know, that turned into wheat, the grasses that turned into wheat and everything that were bred. It's almost like just this geographical chance that they ended up like. I always wonder that with the Indigenous people in Australia. I'm like, you guys were here for 60,000 years and you couldn't create a bow and arrow. You know, like over that time. And it's the wrong way of looking at it. The thing is that they didn't need to. There was no, in order for them to reproduce and have more children, all they had to do, the food and everything was around them, and they found a way of doing that, you know, with the skills and the intelligence that they had, and there was no other push. But there was also you couldn't domesticate a kangaroo, you know, or some of the other large animals that were here prior to the last ice age, the huge wombats and everything, and the massive kangaroos. They just weren't. I don't know how you would ever be able to domesticate an animal that hops, so that it can that it can pull something, right? You need big, sturdy animals that can.
Yeah, you've seen videos of just kangaroos from a car. It's like footage from a car, and it's sort of panning, watching these like a herd of kangaroos going, and they're just clearing these fences by. Yeah. You know, it's like it'll be like a 1.5 meter high fence, and they'd clear it by an extra 0.5 meter. It's just,
exactly.
No way you're keeping those things.
Yeah, controlling them, and then also their build and whether or not they could be used to pull something, or, you know, did they have any fur on them that you could shear off that could be then used for, you could just take the skin off, right, and use that. But I don't know. It is really interesting when you're like, fuck. They had, you know, 40 to 60,000 years, and they just didn't innovate at all, really, past what they probably had when they got here. You maybe the didgeridoo and a few of these other sort of more unique tools that they ended up having and developing here that are unique to Australia. And it is one of those things where you're like, far out. It's almost lucky. You wonder if the period that we had about 12,000 years ago when all of these domestications started happening in Europe was just such a lucky thing, to have happened, where we ended up with effectively farmers around that crescent, the Fertile Crescent, that started producing different crops, and then by chance ended up with these native animals that you could just build effectively a rock circle around them and they couldn't get out. So you could have them as a constant store of food. And then as a result of having those crops and animals, you ended up having goods to trade, which then develops a language being written down, right? A written language that people could use, that then it just ends up exploding, and you end up with all kinds of innovations. And the fact that you can remember things by writing them down after that, right? You can pass on knowledge across generations without actually having to meet anyone and speak words to them, was such a huge game changer that, it just exploded from there. But yeah, it blows my mind that it didn't happen anywhere else, because I think from what I understand about, humans all over the world, there's more difference within groups than there is really between any of them. So any racial group or ethnic group around the world could have done exactly what effectively Westerners and Asians did in Eurasia, but they just didn't have the tools around them to do it, and they didn't bother, right? So
do you subscribe much to the great men of history argument, or great figures of history? So this is, would we have discovered the, scientific method or would we have discovered gravity if someone like Isaac Newton didn't come along? Would we still be? Yeah.
I think we still would have. I think it would be that kind of thing. It's going to happen sooner or later. And this is, when you go bigger than this, it would be so interesting to have a look at other alien cultures across the universe and compare them to that kind of bending of the curve when things started to really pick up in terms of developing technologies and working out these sorts of problems. It would be such an interesting scientific study to be able to do across different races that are effectively independent replications of one another, right? Or replications that independent, what would you say, examples of that thing happening. And so, yeah, it'd be so interesting to see, do they need to work out gravity before they work out this thing, and the theory of evolution, does that come later or beforehand? Or what's the sort of, is there a set sequence of discoveries that happens? It always happens when I'm playing a game called Civilization 6, and they have like this, you have a set sort of series of things that you have to develop in order to get other things, right? You have to work out gravity before you can build a bow and arrow or whatever. I mean, not a bow and arrow, I'm thinking of cannons and all these other things, right? Like you have to get certain knowledge, and then you can build certain technology. And it would be really interesting to know more about what kind of sequence does that happen in across different intelligent life forms that end up being able to, I don't know, develop electricity in civilizations like we have, whether or not they can travel through space. Is there a set sequence they have to follow, or is it arbitrary? Do they even need to understand what evolution is to be able to develop something like penicillin to fight viruses and or bacteria that evolve, or can they just stumble across it and then just believe that it's God doing it and then still have the same result? So it'd be really interesting to be able to see that kind of stuff. But I don't know. I don't think it's you would have these brilliant minds throughout history that I imagine made a big difference. But I think if Charles Darwin didn't publish his theory of evolution, his sort of impetus for doing that was the fact that someone else had discovered it, right? Wallace had gone through Southeast Asia and effectively found the same things, noticed these patterns, and that's why we have Wallace's line. He was like, why the fuck have we got tigers on one side and possums on the other side of this random line that goes through Southeast Asia? How is that explained? And then he sent a letter to Darwin saying, hey, I've got this idea. What do you reckon? And Darwin's like, holy shit. He's about to, beat me to the punch and publish exactly what I've been working on for 3 or 4 decades. And so published it. So I think it's one of those things where, if Einstein hadn't come up with relativity, would we have gotten it later on? I think almost certainly. And the same thing with the interesting thing is stuff like World War I and II, particularly World War II, in terms of developing things like the jet engine and the nuclear bomb. And you're kind of like, fuck. So did we get that way earlier just because we had this massive war? And it's like 100%, like there was no chance anyone was going to be suddenly spending whatever it would have been, tens, hundreds of millions of dollars on these projects, probably billions of dollars on developing an atom bomb or the jet engine at the time, because there was no need, but for the fact that they were going to war, right? And the Americans needed some way of stopping Japan effectively, or telling them there's just no point in you continuing because we'll turn your country into rubble. So it is crazy though when you're like, so if we hadn't had World War II, but we'd all still been born, because that wouldn't have happened obviously, but if we had, what would we be in right now? In terms of development, would this be the 50s? Like, would we have only just worked out how a jet engine works? Would we have had flight? So
yeah. I'm more of a, I suppose, like I feel like the war does more harm than it does good. Like, just think of how much stuff we built only to destroy.
Well, how many lives were lost?
Yeah, just how much. And then how much mayhem caused by those lives lost. How many people are just brokenhearted the rest of their life and don't bother, like tapped out. How many people, limbless and stuff like that for the rest, like a burdens on society rather than productive members.
Even just border shifting, right? And Israel, like being created and being like, good God, guys, like talk about creating a headache for the rest of us for a century to come.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of the big investments though. So that kind of makes sense. Would we have built something like a rocket engine which required multiple failures and so much investment?
Plastics.
That's probably a good point.
I think plastics came from the Second World War as well. I think in large part. I don't know how.
To what extent. So much of the drugs did as well. Meth and things like that.
Did penicillin come around about that time too? Maybe a little earlier.
I think it was. I'm not sure that was war related though. I think that was just some guy.
Well, I think
playing around with algae and.
I think though it was. I think that theory of germs came in from. I can't remember which war it was. Maybe it was a civil war in the US, but I think it was like that. That was a huge part of people working out how disease spread and how infection spread, because you had all these people effectively fighting each other with cannons and single shot rifles, and then just stabbing each other with what was on the end of the rifle, right? And so you had all these people that would get these wounds and would need amputation. And a big spreader of the disease was the guy chopping the legs off with a saw. Just getting on, like, get on the table, dude. It's covered in blood. There's a dead guy there. It's like, pushed him off. Get on the table, dude. We're chopping your leg off. You going to clean that saw? You used that saw on the last 15 guys. He's like, get on the table, dude. We're going to chop your leg off and save your life. And then I think it was one of the surgeons doing this realized that if he just washed his hands, his patients ended up having a significant, chance of living afterwards.
Yeah.
And so again, it's one of those things where you're like, holy crap. So if it weren't for potentially war, at least that war at that time, we may not have gotten, a theory of disease and everything as soon as we did. But when would that have happened and how? It would be interesting. It would be so interesting to know when these developments would have come about without war. If we hadn't had war throughout at least the last 200 or 300 years, where a lot of the industrial revolution and everything has led to these developments, how quickly would we have worked out these things that were effectively dependent on wars happening in our current timeline to have been developed? Would they have happened much more slowly, hundreds of years later, or would it be something where, because there's no war and there's not all this investment being wasted in killing one another and taking over each other's countries, would we be putting that into these technologies? But then you're kind of like, well, why would you be doing that if you didn't have a need to, nuke another country? Why are you going to be developing an atom bomb?
Yeah. I think I could be convinced either way, but my personal dislike of violence of really any form is sort of draws me away and makes me not want to. I was thinking about the aliens as well. Like, imagine if they came here and they look at us and they're like, guys, you could have cured cancer ages ago if you just like mixed tortoise and rabbit together and ate it. and then we're just oh shit.
But there must be so many of
why did we
those
think of
things.
that?
There must be so many of those things, right? With like clearing of the rainforest in the Amazon, where we've probably lost, a whole shitload of cures to different diseases that would have been lying there, in some random rare plant found on the side of a, pig's bum or something that you'll just never know about. So it is difficult. And you look back on history and you're just like, these people believe that the plague was spread through bad rumors in the air or whatever it was, or that it was God's will. He was spreading the plague, and you're just like, mate, it was fleas on the bum of a rat that was carrying a parasite, and that bit the people that were living in poor environments, and that's what spread this disease that effectively can't spread like that ever again because people don't allow rats and fleas to live in their homes.
Yeah, well, 100%. In like 30 years' time or 40 years' time, people look back at COVID and just be like, man, you guys could have solved that so easily. Why don't you just,
There'll be tons of it. China, it's one of those criticisms of China where it's like there are so many things you could have done initially to shut this down, but you were trying to save face and you hid the fact that you knew this thing was spreading around your country, and I think there was evidence that they'd shut down flights from Wuhan to other parts of China, but we're letting them still go to the US. And you're just like talk about, again, whether or not it was intentional, but the system that they have set up there allowed this to happen. So I'm sure anytime you look back at these sorts of things like the outbreak of COVID, there are going to be so many steps where you're just like, oh my God, you guys could have avoided, so many deaths or other issues that then came forth as a result of just dealing with these situations poorly or without the knowledge at the time, right? Like, hindsight's 2020.
Definitely. One thing I'd recommend people to check out, I found about this recently because my dad sent through this video. It's called the Jacques Draws Automata, and it's these sort of 3 doll-like figurines that were created in, let me get this right. I had this written down because I talked about this on my own podcast. There were these. It was in 17. Let me bring it up.
38.
Essentially, there were like clockwork machines that this master clockmaker of watches and whatnot had created, and they were probably about a meter and a little bit high, and they still exist to this day. You can find them in I think it's a German or Swiss museum.
They look like little dolls, right? Porcelain dolls.
Yeah. And so the Pierre Jacques Draws Automata, 1768 and 1774. So around that time period.
Wow.
There's 3 of them. One's the musician, one's the draftsman, and one's a writer. So one of them, you can click a button or turn a crank or something, and this doll will have a pen or a pencil in its hand and draw a figure of a cow or an animal on a piece of paper. The most impressive one is called the rider, and it will, get its hand, get an old sort of like ink, like a quill, I guess, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
Dip it in ink, shake off the droplets, come over, write a couple of lines, and it's got its hand on the table, so it writes a letter, moves the paper across, puts it down. It's just so complex. And this was built in 1768, 1774. Yeah. It's essentially a computer. It's got a series of cogs and machines where it's like, do this if this happens, and you can look into its backside. And the craziest thing is he designed it in a way so that you can just pull out because I think basically it would sort of like, a rod or something would go down, then it would follow the shape of the cog, and this would dictate the movement of the pen of the hand, and then it would drop down another and sort of follow this. And so if you just replaced the cogs, I guess, in it with
so there's like a cylinder of these metal discs down the back in this what looks like a really complex clock in the back of one of these things. Obviously the discs are related to whatever the little dude is drawing or writing, right?
Yeah. And so if you just replace these discs with other discs, you can have an automated writing machine. Like this thing can write letters. If you imagine you just spent a bit more time and it could have fully written out letters. It's almost like a really, really inefficient press, like a writing tool what was it, Gutenberg or Luther was the one who used it for spreading the Bible and whatnot. And I was just thinking, like, man, these things are so complex, so amazing, and this was built, 350 years ago. What, or is it 250? Sorry. What else could have been created if this had sort of just been followed a bit more? If like silicon and like this is before electricity, really, 1768.
Have you seen I think it's called the Antikythera or Kythera mechanism? That ancient Greek mechanism that's like rusted up, and it's probably...
Was this sort of like a steam engine that they'd built?
It looks like some sort of weird computer, but it's like 2,000 years old. It's from...
How do you spell it?
So ANTI, and then Kythera is one word, Kythera, and then mechanism. And I was watching a doco on this, and I think it's used for tracing from memory, the movement of the planets. But it's this ancient Greek device that was made in the 1st century BC. So before Christ, right? So 2,100, 2,200 years ago. And it was effectively 1,500 years ahead of its time. And again, wow. It's just one of these things where you obviously had just some sort of a freak genius clockmaker type person back then who came up with this device to follow the stars and the sun and the moon and the times of these transitions and everything, and worked out the maths behind it. Again, you just sit in there and you're like, fuck me. Like, without the internet, if someone told someone, even a mathematician, go out there and come up with a device like this today and you can't use the internet, you would just be like, that's not happening. Then you can't use a 3D printer or, any kind of, you didn't have iron. I think it's made from copper, right? So you're just like, what? Bronze.
It's made like bronze. Inventing all of these new disciplines on the go, or I'll invent this new branch of mathematics to be able to understand the movement of this thing. And
yeah. It's crazy. So learn about that. Check out a doco. You can buy a recreation of it now, and it's effectively a box, and it has these different cogs and everything in it, and circles that show the movement of timing of these, celestial bodies. I think it's called the zodiac dial, right? So yeah. So it traces things like the ram, the bull, the twins, the crab, Leo, Virgo, Libra, all of that sort of stuff, and their movements. And you're just like, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Anyway, man, we've been going for almost 2 hours. We should probably wrap it up, and I should let you go.
For sure, man, for sure. No, it was fun, man. I could do this for ages, but one needs the camera.
Good. So. Thanks for coming on, man. Thanks for coming on. Where can people find out more about you and the Mere Mortals podcast?
Yeah, for sure. So just type Mere Mortals podcast wherever. We put our stuff on YouTube. It's also on any of the podcasting platforms. And if you want to hit us up, just go to any social media place. You'll find us there. So that's
what's the story behind the podcast? Who's your audience? What are people listening to the Mere Mortals podcast?
Man, I continually struggle with this. Like the things I sort of say is like, it's philosophy in the park. So all of the random stuff we've been talking about today, a lot of that is what Juan and I talk about. Those are my co-hosts. So we've been friends for a very long time. So we'll talk about the automata, then we'll talk about stupid stories, then we'll talk about how, like we travel to Mexico and language things and stuff like that. And then sometimes we'll pick a proper topic like robots or whatnot and dive deep into that. The funny thing is, I've noticed like some of the biggest interactions or like people giving us the biggest feedback who are like, I really love it, have been sort of like middle-aged women. And it's just like, I would never have predicted that. You predict, it would probably be like people around sort of like us, maybe a couple of years younger than us, men, most likely. It was like, no idea. So
one of the interesting ones for me was getting people from places like Texas and the US listening to the Goss episodes. And I was just like, what? How did you find the Goss episodes through the Aussie English podcast when you're a native speaker of English from Texas? You're just like, I guess the internet.
Yeah, that's it, man. You can't predict who will enjoy what in this world nowadays. So if you make your stuff available to all, you'll find random things popping up.
Awesome. Wow, Kyrin, thanks so much, guys. Go check out the Mere Mortals podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Pleasure, mate. We'll do it again soon.